From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. Here's what's ahead. K-State's Augustine Obour will report on his latest cover crop field research. He's been evaluating an array of cool season cover crops for their forage productivity and soil health impacts in a fallow cropping system. Also today, the latest edition of FSA Coffee Talk. From the Farm Service Agency, Todd Barrows will offer several reminders to you producers about USDA programs. Among those, he'll discuss the upcoming ARC and PLC payments on 2020 crop production. And on this week's Wildlife Management segment, K-State's Charlie Lee takes a look at farm pond aeration systems, comparing the types of aeration and their benefits. All that and more straight ahead on this Agriculture Today. You are tuned in to the K-State Radio Network and Agriculture Today. We'll begin with a glance to work that's going on currently at K-State's Agricultural Research Center at Hays, and it is evaluating dual-purpose cover crop systems and how they perform in the way of forage productivity and the eventual soil property effects of those systems. Along with us now via phone is soil scientist based at Hays, Augustine Obour. Augustine, we have seen such a heightened level of interest in cover crops for soil health in recent years. But when we talk about a dual-purpose cover crop, what is being referred to here, if you would?
Yeah, when we talk about dual-purpose cover crops, we're looking at growing cover crops that you can use for forage and at the same time use them to improve soil health. So, as you know, cover crop originally, when we talk about cover crop, is something that you grow. You don't use it for forage or a crop. Mm-hmm. You just grow it in place of fallow and then leave it as a cover crop, not a crop, just to cover the soil, protect the soil, and provide some ecosystem benefits. But here we are looking at the possibility of using cover crops for forage. And if we do that, what will be the impact on soil health? So that is what we are doing here in this research.
Specifically, what cover crop types are you evaluating in this system, Augustine?
Yeah, so we are looking at cool season cover crops. So we planted these cover crops in the spring in sorghum stubble, and we are also planting some of these cover crop in the fall into wheat stubble. So we have both research station experiments, and then we are also looking at on-farm component of this research with collaborative producers across western Kansas.
Are you looking at an array of cool season cover crops then?
Yeah, we're looking at an array of cool season grasses. For example, we're looking at spring oats, spring triticale, spring peas. We're looking at radishes and the barley in this spring planted cover crops. And the winter cover crops, we are looking at winter triticale, rapeseed, and then there's also cereal rye that is being planted in some of these cover crop experiments.
How are these cover crops managed? Are they planted and then left to their own devices, or are any other management steps taken there?
Yeah, good question. So what we are looking at we are based in western Kansas, which is a little bit drier. Mm-hmm. It's a semi-arid environment. So growing a cover crop tends to use water like any other crop, and water is very precious in our environment. So what we are looking at here is to see if we can use this cover crop for forage to get some benefit from these cover crops in terms of some economic benefit, because when you grow cover crop, it uses water, and most years it tends to affect the subsequent crop yield. So our plan or our objective is to look at if we can manage these cover crops as forage. So we plant the cover crop in the fallow phase of our rotation, typically after sorghum harvest in the spring, or we plant them in the fall following wheat harvest. And we don't fertilize the cover crops. We plant them as like any other kind of similar to our forage crops. Mm-hmm. We go in and start grazing the cover crop, or we harvest the cover crop for hay.
Then are you finding, as we get into some of your results here, that there are differences in these various cover crop types in regard to the amount of forage produced?
Yes, absolutely. We started these by looking at different cover crop mixes to see how much forage productivity can we get from this cover crop. So if we want to grow this cover crop for forage, then we want to make sure we can get something that is adaptable to our environment and it can produce more biomass for grazing. So we have cover crops, oat alone as a cover crop. We have single species triticale as a cover crop. We had oat triticale cover crop. We have a 3-species mixes of oat triticale pea. And then we have a 6-way mix of oat triticale pea, radishes, turnip, and then buckwheat. And what we saw, both on-station and then on-farm experiments, is most of this cover crop biomass, it tends to be dominated by the cool season grasses like triticale and oat in the mixture. So when we reduce the amount of the grasses in the mixture, the productivity tends to be less. For example, our cocktail cover crop mix produces about 2,200 pounds per acre, average over 5 years that we've been doing that, compared to 3,000 pounds per acre with oat triticale mix. So the productivity differs based on the mixes and then the species that you have.
And then there's the other aspect that you are greatly interested in here, the production of these cover crops and how they would eventually impact soil health, soil properties. What properties were you examining specifically here, Augustine?
Yeah, so one of the challenges of grazing cover crops or grazing anything in a grain production system is soil compaction. If you graze the cover crop, what is the implication on soil compaction? So we are looking at measuring bulk density and penetration resistance to see if we graze this cover crop, are we introducing any compaction in the soil that will impact water infiltration and the soil quality. Then we are also looking at soil organic carbon content. So one of the things that in dryland environment we are interested in is to produce more biomass to cover the soil surface. If you're grazing the cover crops, that means you are removing the biomass. So would that impact the residue retention on the soil surface that helps in building the soil organic carbon and also the soil structure? So we are looking at bulk density, we are looking at residue cover, we are looking at water infiltration, we are looking at aggregate stability, and most importantly, we are looking at soil organic matter content following grazing of these cover crops.
And how well do those cover crops perform in these respects then?
Yeah, good question. They are doing very well. So far, we haven't seen any negative effect on grazing cover crops in terms of soil bulk density since we started in 2015. It's 1 year where we saw that grazing of the cover crop had an impact, a negative impact on bulk density in the top 2 inches. And what happened on that year is when we put the cattle there to graze, 2 days later we have about 4 inches of rainfall overnight. And when you visit the plot, it wasn't pretty. So we took the cattle out. So we had some cattle trampling on the plots, and that resulted in some compaction in the top 2 inches. But since then, we haven't seen that kind of an effect. And even in that year, when we measured bulk density below 2 inches, we didn't see any difference between the fallow treatment, the cover crop that we grazed, or the cover crop that we left ungrazed.
There's valuable information here, and it would suggest that these cover crops do provide soil health benefits.
Yes, so we are seeing one thing that we have consistently measured is aggregate stability, which is a measure of the susceptibility of the soil to water erosion. Mm-hmm. And we've been seeing significant increases even in no-till compared to no-till fallow, where we have a cover crop. We tend to increase the wet aggregate stability compared to the fallow treatment. And that is very, very good because in our environment, the winds blow all the time. Mm-hmm. So cover crops are providing some protection to the soil, and that helps in maintaining the soil structure.
Summing it up, then, the positives from these cover crop systems seem to truly stand out here. And for the fallow portion of a crop rotation, these cover crops could accomplish a great deal, it seems, Augustine.
Yes, we are seeing a very good improvement in soil properties with these cover crops. The only problem we are having, and it's also the same as our grain production system, is the variability in cover crop productivity. Mm-hmm. The yields varies from year to year. We have yields as high as 3,000 pounds per acre in 2015 to as low as 1,500 pounds per acre. And it all depends on rainfall and temperature conditions in the spring. One thing that we are looking at in our cover crop experiment is to look at flex cover cropping, where we plant the cover crop in years when the weather looks good. We have a favorable year for growing cover crop, and in dry years, we leave the land fallow, similar to having a fallow period. And we are also monitoring this, that if you do this flex cover cropping, would the soil health benefits be similar to when you have continuous cover cropping?
This means, obviously, then, that you will continue this line of study.
Yes, our goal is to have this as a long-term experiment. So we've been doing this so far for 6 years, and we haven't seen any negative effects so far with these cover crops. And we are seeing benefit of the cover crops. But what is the impact long-term? If you removing the above-ground biomass, we are taking about 30 to 40% of the biomass through grazing. So we want to see in the long term what will be the impacts.
Exciting research, and looking forward to you continuing it, Augustine, as you have tested these cover crop systems and come up with quite positive results. Thanks for bringing us up to the moment on what you've found out so far.
Yeah, thank you very much, Eric.
Augustine Obour is the soil scientist at K-State's Agricultural Research Center at Hayes, here on Agriculture Today. Next for you on This Agriculture Today, our regular installment on USDA program activity in Kansas, what we dub FSA Coffee Talk. For over from the Farm Service Agency, this time around is Agricultural Programs Chief Todd Barrows to pass along a handful of important items for you producers out there. Todd, welcome once again, and we are now edging into the latter part of summer, so what we'd like to do here is catch folks up on various program details.
Absolutely, Eric, and what a summer it's been. It seems like it's just flown by. It's good to be with you and your listeners. And as we're approaching fall, these recent temperatures like today aren't feeling much like fall. We need to start thinking about and preparing for some events that are going to be coming up and they're going to be here before we know it. So I wanted just to stop by, update the listeners, and what's needed for their operation plans. We need to talk a little bit about some, fall-seeded small grains and small grain plantings. And, of course, we are preparing for the 2020 payment cycle that always comes out at the beginning of our new fiscal year, so October 1.
Well, when you talk about farm program payments, that always piques the interest of producers out there. Let's begin with that. And October 1 is that the key date?
That is the key date. Of course, those payments will come out soon after that date. It does have to be announced by the department when the specific date, but they try to get them out pretty soon, quickly thereafter, because that is the new budget year. And when we're talking about farm program payments, Eric, I want to talk about the ARC, PLC, and ARC county payments for the 2020 program year. As we have nearing the end of the 2020 marketing year, the average price for wheat, barley, and oats was announced back on June the 30th. And so I wanted to talk about that briefly in case our producers might have missed that. If they were enrolled in the price loss coverage program, or what we commonly refer to as PLC, the wheat payment rate is expected, and again, this is for the 2020 program year, but we're looking at 45 cents per bushel for wheat. Barley, you're looking at 20 cents per bushel, And then there will be no payment calculated for oats, as the price was high enough it didn't calculate a payment for oats.
That's for the PLC payments, to clarify. What about the ARC County program participants?
Yeah. Now, for those producers that may not have elected to go into the PLC program but elected to go in ARC County, or what we call the revenue program, those payments are calculated by multiplying the actual average county yield for the covered commodity. And that covered commodity would be such as, an example would be wheat, corn, grain, sorghum, soybeans, times the higher of either the market year average price or the national loan rate for the applicable commodity that you're calculating the payment for. So for wheat, the market year average price was $5.05 a bushel, which is higher than the loan rate. For barley, the MYA, or the market year average price, was $4.75 a bushel, also higher than the national loan rate. And same can be said for oats as well, with a market year average price of $2.77 a bushel. So to recap that, you will take these market year average value prices, the $5.05 for the wheat, $4.75 for the barley, and $2.77 per bushel for oats, times the county average yield for your applicable county where your crop was physically located or physically grown, to compute your actual revenue. And then payments are earned when the actual revenue is less than the guarantee, and the payment rate cannot exceed 10% of the guarantee rate.
So those are the mechanics of the ARC County payments as they'll be coming out. Noting that there are no announcements on any payment levels for the feed grains for a time here.
That's right, yeah, because we talk about that market year average price. And so the marketing year for your corn, grain, sorghum, soybean crops doesn't end till September the 30th. So even though the majority of the crop has been marketed, we cannot make an announcement on those prices, that market year average price, till after the September 30th deadline. However, at this time, if you look at several ag news media publications that are out there, they are anticipating PLC will not generate a payment for those feed grain crops. But again, I want to stress, that's just a projection. It's not official.
Stay tuned for the official word from your USDA on that. Something that you mentioned earlier, Todd, about farm operating plans. What is the stipulation there?
Yeah, Eric, I just want to bring up once again, for all producers, regardless of what programs or what benefits they're applying for, every producer, whether they're conducting their business as an individual or as a business entity, you have to have an up-to-date farm operating plan of operation. So in the fall, we like to encourage, or FSA likes to encourage our producers to take a few extra minutes and review those farm operating plans of operation to make sure that they are up to date for the next program year. And when I talk about up to date, have you rented more land, purchased land, have you leased land, or sold any? You need to make those changes on your farm operating plan. I also want to stress the importance of making sure, if you're an entity, to make sure your member records are up to date for that entity and make sure they're correct.
If you're not sure if changes are due, simply stop by your local FSA or be in contact with them.
Yeah, if you would want to visit with the local FSA office, they can give you a copy of your current operating plan that's on file, and they would be more than happy to go over that with you to make sure it's current.
Todd, as you mentioned earlier, belying the weather that we have right now, fall-seeded small grain crops, producers need to be thinking in that direction, you say?
Yeah, I just wanted to just bring to your attention again, because as things progress this fall and get busy with planting of small grains and harvest, just to remind producers, they should be reporting their fall-seeded crops for harvest in 2022 calendar year. You can report those after planting but no later than December the 15th in order to be considered timely filed, not only with FSA, but also with your crop insurance company or your crop insurance agent.
Be thinking ahead to that because a number of those crops will be going in the ground within the next 5 or 6 weeks to start with anyway in parts of Kansas. Lastly, Todd, what's the word on the operations of local FSA outlets as far as the pandemic restrictions and the like?
Yeah, I just wanted to touch base, Eric, and thanks for bringing that question up. It's a great question because it varies across the state, literally with every service center in our state. And what I mean by that is, first of all, I want to be very clear in the fact that our employees are at work, the service centers are open for business, and we are working with producers to cover their applications, their enrollments for benefits, and their reporting business. Now, with that, though, based on the pandemic, it's an evolving world, and we got to be flexible. And so just want to put out a reminder that while the office doors may be closed to some because of the area of that location and the status as we progress in these counties with the pandemic, we are there for service and we are there for business. So I would advise you, if you're wanting to do business with FSA or needing to take care of something with FSA, that you contact the office prior to arrival so that they can help you with their current state of operation. And so then they can serve you in the most customer-friendly way that's possible. And that may be by appointment, it may be by phone, and it may be by some other means. But we are open for business, but I would recommend you calling ahead.
Very good. And any things to impart as we wrap up here, Todd?
As we wrap up, I just want to stress the importance today with our listeners that as we move forward, we appreciate your patience. We appreciate your understanding. We are there. FSA is there, and the service centers are there to help you all. We know how important these benefits and these programs are to you, and we appreciate that working relationship. And we just ask that you work with us so together we can better serve everybody and do the right thing.
Communicate with your local FSA personnel on any of these matters or any others regarding your USDA program participation. And Todd, we appreciate you coming over and sharing these thoughts today. Many thanks.
Thank you, Eric. It's always been great to come by and just have a chat and share some of the program information with the listeners.
And we'll have you back again quite soon. That's Todd Barrows, Agricultural Programs Chief with the Farm Service Agency State Headquarters for Kansas here in Manhattan, and with the latest edition of FSA Coffee Talk, featured every other Tuesday here on Agriculture Today. Now this break, when we return, today's agricultural news headlines, this week's edition of Milk Lines with K-State's Mike Brook, and more for you here on the K-State Radio Network. Welcome back to Agriculture Today here on the K-State Radio Network. Eric Atkinson with you. Agricultural news headlines for you now. The Kansas Crop Progress and Condition Report out from the USDA this week reads like this. As of this past weekend, our topsoil moisture in the state was at 1% surplus and 51% adequate, at 48% short to very short. Subsoil was at 1% surplus, 54% adequate moisture, and 45% short to very short. The condition of the corn crop in Kansas was at 65% good to excellent, 26% fair, and 9% poor to very poor, with corn silking now at 93%. Corn in the dough stage at 62% and corn in the dent at 12%. That is behind the average of 20% for the date. Soybean crop conditions, 60% good to excellent, 33% fair, and 7% poor to very poor. Soybeans blooming now at 80% and setting pods at 49%. As for the grain sorghum crop in the state, 62% good to excellent, 30% fair, 8% poor to very poor. Sorghum headed now at 59%, and sorghum coloring is at 9%. Pasture and range conditions in the state, 49% good to excellent, 36% fair, and 15% poor to very poor. For a glance at the corn and soybean conditions nationally now, we turn to the USDA's Stephanie Ho.
One focus for the week ending August 8th is conditions for corn and soybeans.
A little bit of a mix, corn making a slight improvement, soybeans down a little bit more, and all under the banner of cool weather, but still dry in most areas of the Midwest.
USDA meteorologist Brad Rippey first looks at corn condition.
First time in a number of weeks we've seen an actual increase in conditions. Now, 64% of the corn rated good to excellent. That is up 2 percentage points from last week. No change in the very poor to poor rating, steady at 11%.
Looking at the latest condition ratings for soybeans.
As I mentioned, we saw a very small decrease in the condition. Now, no change in the good to excellent ratings, steady at 60%. But the very poor to poor ratings up 13% from 12% a week ago. That number, of course, driven by crop stress in the upper Midwest.
This is Stephanie Ho for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
The USDA has released its latest agricultural land values report showing a substantial year-over-year increase in values this year. With a closer look at that, the USDA's Rod Bain.
Up, up, and up. The summary of agricultural land values for 2021. USDA Chief Economist Seth Myers says year over year,
when you see you're at 7% for all of it, and you're closer to 8% for the cropland,
and close to 6% increase in pasture land value from 2020, this reflects
that commodity prices were on a run from about August 20 through April or May in some cases.
Particularly commodities like corn, soybeans, hogs, and to a lesser extent, cattle. In addition, producer optimism about returns on land going forward also drove the rise in ag land values. Meyer adds,
that 7% is a big number, and we last saw that increase back in 2013-14, and seeing those kinds of increases in 13-14, we were kind of hitting some of those higher prices. And now we've seen land values with a pretty substantial increase year over year for 21.
I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
Next up, this week's Milk Lines. Here's K-State dairy specialist Mike Brook. Mike?
Today I'd like to visit with our Kansas dairy producers concerning where we're producing milk in the United States and how that milk is actually being utilized in terms of manufacture of dairy products. As we look over the past 5 years, there have been significant changes in where we're actually producing milk in the United States, and actually there's been significant growth here in the Midwest. The Milk Market Administrator actually divides the United States into 3 different regions. One would be the Western region, which is essentially west of the Rockies, and the other 2 regions would be the Midwest or Central, along with the Eastern Seaboard. So basically the Appalachian Mountains would be the division on the east between the Eastern Seaboard and the Midwest or Central region. So when we look at milk production in the United States, when we look at raw milk production, about 43% of the milk in the U.S. in 2020 was actually produced in the central part of the nation, 40% being produced out west. The interesting thing is the growth over the last 5 years. Here in the central region, we've grown by almost 12% over where we were at 5 years ago. In the West, it's been still some growth, but just much slower, a little less than 6%. So when you think about some of the recent announcements by Hillmar and Kansas Dairy Ingredients to build processing plants here in Kansas, which would be part of the Midwest, you can see that we probably are on track to see significant growth in our milk production here in the central part of the nation over the next several years. When we look at things like cheese production, again, there's been some increased growth, and some of that has occurred here in the Midwest, and it's actually been faster than it has been in the West. Currently, we produce about 47% of the total cheese produced in the United States here in the Midwest. But over the last 5 years, that has grown by about 16% as compared to a growth rate of only about 7% in the West. So again, you can see that we see some expansion in our dairy processing capabilities here in the central part of the country, which is very important to the future of our dairy industry here in the central United States. Butter production, again, a lot of that is produced in California, over 50% of the total, but about 40% produced here in the Midwest. And our growth in butter production in the Midwest has been slower over the last 5 years as compared to that in California. Another area that's interesting to note is the growth in ice cream. Here in the Midwest, we produce about 59% of the ice cream in the U.S., compared to only about 18% of the total production in the western part of the United States. However, when you look at the trends over the last 5 years, ice cream production in the West has actually fallen by almost 30%, while we've gained almost 10% here in the Midwest during that time. So again, another opportunity that we've had for growth. Another growth area for us in the Midwest has been non-fat dried milk production. While 60% is still produced in the western part of the United States and only 22% here in the Midwest in the last year, we've seen a growth over the last 5 years of almost 45% here in the Midwest. So significant growth in the Midwest, not so much in the West. So as we look at our dairy industry here in the central part of the United States, a lot of categories that we're gaining on, total milk production as well as production of several of the major dairy products that we consume are also increasing in production right here close to home, right here in Kansas. This is Mike Brook with K-State Research and Extension.
All right, Mike, many thanks. And you're listening to Agriculture Today. Agriculture Today returns now, and it's our time set aside every week to talk wildlife management. Aboard once again is former K-State Research and Extension wildlife specialist Charlie Lee. Charlie, today on the particulars of pond aeration and those methods of doing so, but let's start with why would one want to aerate their farm pond?
Well, if you have a properly designed and installed aeration system, it's going to slow down the eutrophication process of the pond. It's going to help prevent summer and winter fish kills and greatly prolong the life of your pond. So it depends on the intensity of your management. There certainly are a lot of benefits to aeration of a pond. You can break down the decaying vegetation that's in the pond. It's going to also reduce the muck and the sludge that's found on the bottom of the pond. It has the potential to reduce algae blooms. It can improve water clarity and improve water quality, including oxygen levels for fish and other aquatic wildlife. There are other benefits, including reducing potential odors that sometimes ponds smell like sulfur or the rotten egg smell, and it's going to reduce the likelihood of fish kills. So those are the benefits of pond aeration. And a pond that's properly aerated may hold as many as twice as many fish per volume as a non-aerated pond.
What directly, though, would tip one off as to the need for aeration to achieve what you're talking about in the way of benefits?
Well, this is the time of year when many fish kills occur. As we've talked about in the past, when water is warmer, that warm water develops on the surface of the pond. And as it grows through the summer, that surface layer gets thicker and it sets on the cooler layer that's at the thermocline. When that turns over and the cool water gets to the top, and that can happen by late in the fall, or if you get a sudden influx of cold rainwater, you get the pond to turn over and you have a summer fish kill. So if you see fish that are gulping on the surface, that usually means they're low on oxygen, and that would be a visual cue that you need to get aeration in a pond, and it needs to be done very rapidly. Unfortunately, it's oftentimes too little too late, so it needs to be planning ahead. If you think you're going to have a problem, then you need to get aeration installed early.
Well, then, how to accomplish needed aeration? You say there are two methods.
Well, there are two types of aeration systems. You can have surface aeration and you can have bottom diffusion aeration. The surface aeration is usually fountains or surface agitators or even big circulators that may be run off of tractor power takeoffs. Bottom diffusion systems are broken down into kind of three categories as well. That's something that's grid-based or electrically operated systems, solar-operated, or windmill or wind-driven systems. The surface aeration is typically used in the most shallow ponds. In ponds that have a deep area, some of the bottom diffusion systems are more efficient, but surface aeration is typically used in aquaculture facilities and in shallower bodies of water.
Which of the options under those two headings to choose from, though? Any tips on that?
Well, I like the bottom diffusion systems. Oftentimes, the surface systems are perhaps more driven by aesthetics than actual function. Now, there are some surface systems that will withdraw water from the bottom, and then you get some good benefits there. But I think the bottom diffusion systems require less energy and move a tremendous amount of volume of water in the pond by introducing oxygen at the bottom, which actually isn't adding that much oxygen to the pond, but it's acting as a pump to push that water from the bottom up to the surface where it can be oxygenated.
How much of an investment are we talking about with the bottom diffusion aerators?
Well, you can get those systems in various sizes. It really depends on how big your pond is. That includes both surface area and depth, so you need to know those. You need to know, is it a fairly even pond bottom, bowl-shaped, or are there some areas that are much deeper? In order to select the right system, I would encourage folks to do a good job of consulting with several companies that provide systems. Make sure you get their ideas, and you're probably going to be talking in the $3,000 or $4,000 range for probably one of the lower cost systems. Now, there are a lot of people that say, well, I don't have electricity to the site, so let's try a wind system. Well, a wind-operated system may work, but oftentimes when their oxygen is at the lowest, which is just before it gets light in the morning, it's not very windy. So they're not doing a good job at that point in time. So there are some problems with those. They're only going to be working when the wind is blowing. The solar systems are only going to be working when you have sunlight, which again, the lowest oxygen is during the night, unless you have batteries that are going to supplement through the nighttime. And they may be the only option for ponds that don't have electricity nearby or that don't have a lot of wind. Perhaps they're down in the bottom of a valley or draw. So I would encourage people to do a good job of looking how close electricity is. It's much cheaper to pump the air distance to the pond rather than run electricity to the pond. Typically, we're looking at small compressors, and there are various types of compressors. Some may be as small as a quarter horsepower, which are adequate for ponds up to 1 to 2 acres. So there's lots of things to think about. Deciding which aeration system to get. You have to decide whether it's the surface aeration or bottom diffusion aeration. The bottom diffusion aeration is simply just like an aquarium bubbler, only on a pond-size scale. So once you make that determination, then you have to select some other options of which type of compressor you want and how do you want that compressor to be operated.
As you can hear, it requires full assessment not only of the options for aeration, but the mere need to turn that pond, if you will, through an aeration process. Charlie, thanks for going over the options with us. He's a wildlife specialist formerly of Kansas State University. That's Charlie Lee. And that is our time for today. Thanks for listening in. Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.